So in our 8 o'clock prayer meeting the other day, we were drawn to Ezekiel 4. And I think that was mostly because it is a little bit strange. And we were having fun. And why not have fun in Scripture? But more than just having fun, we need to look at these passages and say, what is it that we can get out of them? And of course we did. And I thought it'd be good to share some of that today. Now, Ezekiel 4 is one of the passages in Ezekiel that makes sure that he secures top spot in that list of weird Old Testament prophets. He really is probably the strangest, although there are some other strange parts around. But let's just look beyond the strange and see what is it that we can get out of this really quite difficult passage. Now you can read it, Ezekiel chapter 4 verses 1 to 15, that's where I am. I'm not going to read all that, I'm just going to paraphrase a little bit. So the paraphrase goes something like this. So Ezekiel was asked to make this big model of Jerusalem out of clay. And he had to draw on it and make it look like Jerusalem with all of its towers and its gates and all that kind of thing. And then he had to make it look like it was under siege, so with siege engines and banks of earth and ladders and all that kind of stuff. And make this model of Jerusalem like it's under siege. And then everybody had to be able to see this. So maybe it's in his front garden. But it gets worse. So next, he's told to lie down. And he's got to lie down on his side for 390 days. And then when that's over, he's got to turn over and lie for another 40 days. All of this being very symbolic. But it gets worse. Because in all of that time, he's only allowed to eat siege rations. So, very basic food, basic grain and that kind of thing. And he's only allowed to drink a siege ration of water. So probably just under a litre, it appears. All this is very strange, but it gets worse. In all of that time, he's going to be tied down. And it gets worse. Any cooking that he's going to do, he's got to do on human excrement. And it's at that point that Ezekiel says, do what? No. Now, it's a fairly common at this point to go, I don't get this, and move on. But let's just see what we can actually get out of this really, really quite strange passage. You see, Ezekiel is a man who has been transformed by a vision of God, isn't he? And he's all out for God, but at the same time he understands that man's sin has separated us from God completely. We know that he's married, we know that he's got a house, we know he's got responsibilities. Do you know what? Apart from some of the strange things he does, he's basically just like us. So the question I have out of this passage is, how far are you prepared to go for God? What is your limit? At what point will you say, stop, God, this far and no further? So let's just think what Ezekiel was prepared to do. Firstly, he completely understood that effect of sin, right? He understood God's total rejection of evil. But he cared for those around him. And he, therefore, in getting that, he didn't hide himself away. He was prepared to make a fool of himself to explain the problem to them. Making a fool of himself was not the point at which he said, no further God. To what extent are you prepared, are we prepared to look strange, to look different, to look uncompromising to those around you? Is that your stop point? Well, let's move on. Secondly, more than being prepared to make a fool of himself, he was prepared to do it day in and day out for well over a year plus 2 months and a bit, lying on his side. He's prepared to give up his normal life because he understood how this mattered. He had to get it across. How constant are we prepared to be? Ezekiel was prepared to suspend normal life for this cause. Now, we're not normally expected to do such weird things, but we are told not to conform to the ways of the world. Are we prepared to do that day in and day out, step away from the normal conversations, from fruitless activities, from things that have no lasting benefit? Are you prepared to do that? Or is that your stopping point? I'm attached to my more normal life, so I'm not prepared to do that. But there's more. Ezekiel was prepared to live off scanty provisions for all of that time, way over a year, to eat poor quality food, not for a day, not for a week, but for well over a year. Why? To demonstrate something. Again, we're not called to do that. But what if we were? Put yourself in Ezekiel's shoes for a moment and challenge yourself. Is your choice of food or drink or having plentiful supply of both of them, is that more important to you than your mission in God? Would that be the point at which you say, this far and no further. But Ezekiel's got more. What about your freedom to go where you choose, to see who you want? What if you had to give that up in order to serve God? Would that be your stopping point? What was the point at which Ezekiel said this far and no further? He's accepted a loss of face, he's accepted a loss of self-respect, he's accepted a loss of plentiful supply of food and drink, he's accepted a loss of freedom. He knew that all that was of less value to him than helping others to see that faith in God was worth it. What was the point that Ezekiel said this far and no further? It was when Ezekiel was asked to compromise his holiness. Cooking over human excrement will cause him to be unclean. Now, we've got a completely different way of considering what holiness looks like, how we are to be holy now, of course. But in his context, that was where he was at. Only when he would appear unholy before God did he say, I don't want to do that. Can I have an alternative? He'd give up everything else that we value beyond all else. But he refused to compromise on his holiness. And God understood, and he relented. Now, of course, God's grace would have been sufficient. He was the one doing the asking, for goodness sake. But he saw Ezekiel's heart, his desire to be holy before a holy God. And he changed. Is that a challenge we can take on board? Not the idea that we're to do strange things, but where do we find our point of compromise for God? At what point do we say, this far and no further? Because we've seen the goodness of God through the remarkable love and sacrifice of Jesus. His limit was death on a cross. And we've seen his glory through the resurrection, through the ascension. We're loved, we're filled with the Spirit, and of course we're covered by grace. But we're called to be all out for him, to pursue holiness, that we would reflect his glory in every aspect of our character, to bring holiness to completion in the fear of God. If we live by the Spirit, let's also keep in step with the Spirit. So how far is too far for you? It's a constant challenge, isn't it?